Welcome to No Rares Required, episode 26, Azorius Knights. Although Dimir was the early frontrunner, as the set has matured, Azorius has taken the lead as the best archetype. The archetype on Magic the Gathering Arena is labeled as Knights, a fast-paced, tribal tempo deck, but that is certainly not the only thing that the archetype is capable of. You can also have Raff spells, which can play a very grindy, controlling attrition strategy, or a blue-white Phyrexian strategy. The options are plentiful, and it's no secret. It's the second most popular archetype on 17 lands, and I will do my best to point out the cards that branch into the alternative strategies. My Tier S Mythic level common is Preening Champion. We only have one more blue archetype to cover, and spoiler, it will start with the same two commons as this guide. Preening Champion is amazing, and guess what? It's a knight! So not only is it amazing at getting bodies on the board for convoke spells, it also has knight synergies if you end up being knight tribal. An easy pack one pick one for a common, but the secret is out. They are usually gone by pick 3 or 4. Next up at Tier 2, we have Afara's Dispersal. There are so many games where I find myself saying, well, if I top deck a Dispersal, I'm still in this, or I'm dead if they have a Dispersal. It does so much for one blue, and it's an easy card to bluff since you only need to add a stop to combat to represent that you have this, and if you have the one blue mana untapped. Let the mind games begin. I've also used a fair amount of it at full cost to permanently remove incubator tokens, especially if they have reach from Tangled Skyline. Even more, it goes around pick 5 or 6, which seems very late to me with how often I snag these as soon as I see them. My other Tier 2 common that I want as many as I can grab is Aerial Boost. Even more mind games. The boards tend to be relatively close power-wise, so threatening to make your 2/2 Vigilance Knight into a 4/4 can be enough to convince your opponent to just let the damage through, and you still get to hold it up on defense, even if your lands are tapped out from curving out, as long as you have 2 untapped creatures. Which is why it pairs very nicely with the Vigilance cards in white, and I want Aerial Boost regardless of which Azorius strategy I end up running. It's even better too is you can plan on picking these up on the wheel, or at least around pick 7 or 8. Now for Tier 3, I found myself less interested in splashing in Azorius for the most part. Sometimes Jeskai if you're doing Raff spells, or Esper if you pick up an Invasion of Amonkhet. But there won't be a Tier 4, like I've done in the other episodes, where I recommend picking up Fixing instead of certain commons in Pack 1, at least this week. But Tier 3 is where the cards start to differentiate into specific strategies. Angelic Intervention is great in the Raff's spell deck because it's a spell that protects Raff, but it's a little less of what I want if I end up in the Phyrexian archetype. It performs decent enough in the proactive tempo knight deck, and I've run up to 4 of them. The earlier in the game, the smaller the board state, and the smaller the board state, the more likely that they will only have one color among their blockers, meaning you can make your creature unblockable on top of giving it a +1/+1 counter. The downside, though, is with knights, you are aiming to curve out at least until turn 4, so holding up the 2 mana to use this in response to removal can be a little awkward, but Operation Invincible Preening Champion can carry you to the trophy, as it did in my Can't Touch This tribal deck. This is another card that you can also plan on taking late, around pick 7 or 8. Next up at Tier 3, we have Knight of the New Coalition. This is a card that I only really want if I'm doing the Knight tribal strategy. You're aiming to get your total knight count to be 11 or above, and this is one of the knights at common that you want to aim to grab. Outside of the knight strategy, I've found this card to just be filler, and they go at a reasonable rate for a common. You can pick them up around pick 6 or 7. Also at tier 3, we have Swordsworn Cavalier. This is also a card that you only want in the Knight's Tribal strategy. Otherwise, I found it to just be filler. So it, along with the Knights of New Coalition, make a decent signal that the archetype is open if you see them late, and I try to pick them up around pick 6 or 7. Eyes of Gytaxius, I also put at tier 3. I'm less interested in this if I'm doing the Knight Tribal strategy. I still find it to be decent filler, but it's much better in the Raff's spell deck or the Phyrexian archetype because it does slow your tempo down. Developing the board but being card neutral is great the longer the game goes, and I've loved this card. You can also pick these up around pick 6 or 7. Saiba Cryptomancer, I also put at tier 3. Similar to Angelic Intervention, this is more important to protect something like Wrath or Preening Champion, but it gives you a body instead of being a spell. You really don't want to have to play this out on turn 2, so when making your curve, I don't count this as a 2-drop. It's much better around turn 4 onward, and a perfect inclusion for Operation Invincible Preening Champion. Seriously, I ran 4 of these Cryptomancers and 3 Angelic Interventions in my Can't Touch This tribal deck, and it was a blast. If you can't find interaction, which is one of the downsides to this archetype, it doesn't have the greatest spot removal. One strategy is just make your opponent's removal useless. This is also a card you can take around, take late around pick 6 or 7. Now for the uncommons. Azorius has 2 tier S mythic level uncommons. First up is Norn's Inquisitor, a superstar and cornerstone to making the Phyrexian strategy work, but it's also great regardless of which strategy you run it in. A 3/3 token on turn 3 for 2 lets you attack while holding up aerial boost, since you won't be attacking with Norn's Inquisitor itself. This card goes in every white archetype, and it's no secret, this card will be gone by pick 2 or 3. And my other tier S mythic level uncommon is Marshal of Zhalfir. The Night Lord is obviously best in the Knight Tribal strategy, but even just having the ability to tap other target creatures makes it quite good, since you can essentially remove 2 blockers by tapping it at the end of their turn, and then again on your turn. And its casting cost means it's not being picked up outside of the blue-white drafters, so you can pick these up around pick 4 or 5, and I've seen people pick up a full playset of these in pod drafting during some of the limited tournaments I play in, and I dream of the day that I will get to do the same. At tier 1 we have Captive Weird. I've enjoyed having these in all 3 strategies. It gives you a creature to tap with Wrath, or for Convoke, and then it flips into Completed Conjurer, which is a Phyrexian, and it will get the +1/+1 counter off of having Norn's Inquisitor in play. It's a little less awesome in the Knight's Tribal strategy, but as a 1-drop, you aren't missing out on too much to include it, and it can give you some late-game card draw if you get stalled out. They also aren't highly sought after and get picked up around 4 or 5. Now for tier 2. Artistic Refusal I've enjoyed in all 3 strategies. I'm more interested in this card specifically for Raff spells or the Phyrexians, since the game tends to go longer, so countering their bomb becomes more important. But Knights tends to fill the board with creatures, especially Preening Champion and Knight of New Coalition, and Knights have a fair amount of vigilance, so this can protect you from having your board wiped by Invasion of Fiora in black or Sunfall in white. They also can be picked up at an average rate for an uncommon, around pick 4 or 5. Also at tier 2 we have Skyclave Aerialist. A 2/1 flyer for 2 is great in every archetype, and it flips into Skyclave Invader, a 2/4 Phyrexian, so it gets the +1/+1 counter if you have Norn's Inquisitor in play, and it draws you a card. You aren't likely to look to flip it in the Knight's strategy unless you get stalled out and need to find an answer, but they tend to get picked up a little early and around pick 3 or 4, and I don't mind running as many as I'm past in either strategies. Now for tier 3 and slightly more nuanced choices, Xeric Strobe Knight is a knight. Honestly, having 2/2 flying knights between Strobe Knight and Preening Champion is just so good, especially if you have Marshall to make them into 3/3s. This also works well in the Raff spell deck, since you can do silly things like, play 2 spells, draw 2 cards, and create a 2/2 all during their turn. I want these a little less if I'm strictly Phyrexian, but even then, it's still decent filler. A 2/2 Vigilance Flyer for 3 with upside grabs lots of people's interest, and so it goes around pick 3 or 4. Tetsuko Umezawa Fugitive, I put at tier 3, and it really depends on how many Swordsworn Cavaliers, the 3/1 for 2, and Skyclave Aerialists, the 2/1 Flyer for 2, you've picked up. If you have 3 to 5, then this becomes quite alluring, and since I only want the Cavaliers in the Knight tribal deck, this becomes a Knight card kind of by association. The upside, it goes late for an uncommon and can be picked up around 5 or 6. Astral Wingspan, I also put at tier 3. It plays well on vigilance creatures, which Knights and sometimes Phyrexians tend to have. Since it's an enchantment, though, it doesn't trigger Raff, but it is card neutral since it draws a card. I like to run 1, and sometimes loading up on a Saiba Cryptomancer can be fun because it's protected by Hexproof. This one goes late around pick 6 or 7, but I'd be careful running multiple copies since this doesn't help you if you've fallen too far behind on the board. Phyrexian Awakening I also put at tier 3. I only actively seek them out if I'm in the Phyrexian strategy, otherwise they make decent filler. But giving all of your Phyrexians vigilance, including cards that transform into Phyrexians like Captive Weird and Skyclave Aerialist, works very nicely, especially with cards like Aerial Boost or Astral Wingspan that pair nicely with the vigilance. They tend to get picked up by turn 4 or 5, so finding the right time to pick these up can be tricky, since using pick 4 or 5 for filler, if you don't end up with enough for the Phyrexian strategy, feels pretty bad. My last tier 3 uncommon is Raff. Hopefully it goes without saying that you really want this if you are in the Raff spells deck. A decent filler option in Phyrexians for additional value and card draw, or for a late game pump in Knights. But so many cards already have vigilance, and the truly go wide strategy is it Convoke. In Phyrexians, Eyes of Gytaxius, as well as Sunder the Gateway, the disenchant that can also just make a 2/2 Phyrexian, are both spells that create Phyrexian creatures, so you can make Raff work, but I've found Raff to be best in a deck with 10 or 11 spells. The dream is to pick up a Chrome Host Seed Shark and be Phyrexian spells. I took down a Peeps and Keeps tournament this way, and the other thing, too, that's nice about the Raff spells strategy is that you can pick up Raff late, around pick 6 or 7. I'd be careful using him as a signal, though, since I think he does often get overlooked. Now for the rares. My first tier S superstar and reason to be in white is Sunfall. If you open this up in pack 1 or 2, I highly recommend trying to make white work, even if the rest of your deck ends up being mediocre, because this card just wins you the game. There's nothing special about it in Azorius, it's a tier S bomb in every white archetype, and an easy pack 1 pick 1. My next tier S superstar rare is Boonbringer Valkyrie, also a reason to stop everything you were planning to do and just head into white. This card also wins you the game when you play it. Even if they have removal for it, you still get a turn where you get a +1/+1 counter, flying, first strike, and lifelink on something as long as your board isn't entirely empty. It's absolutely busted in every white archetype, and an easy pack 1 pick 1. My third and final tier S superstar is Zephyr Singer. Although my brain immediately went to is it Convoke when I first saw this card, giving all of your Vigilance Knights flying is much more impressive than a bunch of 1/1s, and I stand by my claim that Zephyr Singer's best archetype is Azorius. I'm going to skip Chromhost Seed Shark. Its best archetype is in Simic, since it pairs incredibly well with Tangled Skyline, the green enchantment for 5 that gains 5 life and makes a 5/5 incubator token. With Chromehost Seed Shark, it makes 2 5/5 incubator tokens, and it gives all of your Phyrexians reach. But I have to admit, if you can pull off Raff spells with Chromehost Seed Shark, you're going to have a fun time. Guardian of Girapur, I put at tier 3, and its best archetype is Azorius. Blinking a Preening Champion or Knight of New Coalition comes to mind at common, but there are plenty of targets with decent enter the battlefield effects. I'm going to skip over Fairy Mastermind. Every blue archetype likes a 2/1 flash flyer for 2 with upside. Loris of the Dream Den, I put at tier 3. Difficult, if not impossible, to companion in this set. It's still a 3/2 lifelink for 3 that brings back your Sword Cavaliers every turn. This is a card that demands removal, and is a great reason to pick up Cryptomancers and Angelic Interventions to protect it. My last tier 3 rare is Yorion Sky Nomad, the legendary bird serpent. It's great in every blue or white archetype, and I think its best archetype is actually Dimir, just since the deepest archetype is Dimir, and you might be able to pull off playing it as a companion. Similar to Guardian of Girapur, this can blink your Preening Champions or Knights of New Coalition for extra creatures, but it can also hit enchantments, so it works nicely with Phyrexian Awakening for an extra 4/4 as well. My next tier 3 rare is Quintorius, Loremaster. If you've played Boros at all in this set, you've probably experienced how this card doesn't match the archetype at all. It's better in Rakdos, Izzet, and Azorius, and I think specifically Raff spells is its best archetype, making all of your spells that you've previously played into 3/2s that then can sacrifice to play the spells again, while also giving you bodies to tap to draw cards with Raff, is a reason I mentioned earlier that sometimes you want a little Jeskai in your life. Now for the mythics. Elesh Norn Grand Cenobite is tier S in every white archetype, except for Boros, where, like Atali, a cost of 7 mana is just too much for the archetype. Giving all of your creatures +2/+2 and all of theirs -2/-2 usually just wins you the game on the spot, but if not, then you also get a 4/7 Vigilance Phyrexian. At tier 1, we have Archangel Elspeth. Nothing special about her in Azorius, but I haven't gotten to mention a lot of the white mythic bombs yet, and she is definitely one of them. For 1 loyalty, she can create a 1/1 white soldier token with lifelink. For -2 loyalty, she can give target creature 2 permanent +1/+1 counters and flying, the ability that I've seen used the most. And then for -6, she can ultimate to bring back all mana value 3 or less permanents from your graveyard to the battlefield. I have yet to see this ultimate happen, since giving something +2/+2 and flying tends to be good enough to just win the game, especially on your Vigilant Knights. My last tier 1 mythic worth a special mention is Invasion of New Phyrexia. One of my favorite moments in this set was tutoring for this with Hoarding Broodlord in Dimir, so I could cast it for X=10 with Convoke. This card is better the longer the games go, so it might even be better in Dimir than it is in Azorius, but at the end of the day it makes X Knight tokens, so you know it's an easy inclusion. Then after 6 defense, you can flip it into Teferi Akosa of Zhalfir. That's right, a Teferi that cares about creatures instead of spells and extra turns and time manipulation. In all honesty, I'm not sure it's worth flipping most of the time because of the high defense, but I've been against opponents who have done it, and sometimes your inner Timmy just wants to have fun with the cool cards. So that's it for my take on Azorius. As always, next week I'll be covering a different archetype, so if you have one that you want me to cover, just let me know in the comments below. I hope you find this guide useful and helpful in navigating your future blue-white drafts, and if you're new to my podcast, welcome, and thank you for hitting like and subscribe. You can also catch me live on Twitch or reach out to me on Discord. The links will be in the description below. Good luck in your drafts, and I'll see you all next week.